Thank you for joining us for today's How To webinar series. We are going to start in just a few minutes. We'll let a few more people get on the call. Thank you for joining us for this installment of the Root Cause Coalition's How To webinar series. My name is Rachel Carlson, and I am the Membership Coordinator at the Root Cause Coalition. Before we get started, I want to go over a few logistical items for the webinar. Attendees will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to view at rootcausecoalition.org later this week. Our panelists will be taking audience questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question during the presentation, please type your question into the question pane located at the right side of your screen. We are so excited to have our esteemed panelists join us to share their expertise on moving your organization from trauma-aware to trauma-informed. At this time, I would like to pass it off to Abe from Alive and Well Communities.
Thank you, Rachel. My name is Abe Stokes. I'm the director of Alive and Well Kansas City. And in a minute, you'll also hear from Sean Marks. He's our director of training and technical assistance for Alive and Well Community as a whole. Alive and Well Communities originally started out of St. Louis, Missouri. It started as an awareness campaign under the Regional Health Commission. And from there, the work really continued to grow, and Alive and Well Communities became its own 501c3, and originally was called Alive and Well St. Louis. Again, I'm on the Kansas City side. In Kansas City, the Resilient KC initiative under the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant with the Kansas City Chamber here for 2 years, did a lot of work around raising awareness around trauma and toxic stress. As that grant came to an end, the question was, hey, how do we continue this great work? Well, our great partners about 3 hours away in St. Louis with Alive and Well St. Louis, we're going strong, and we're also doing a lot of work around awareness and how do we address trauma and toxic stress in our communities. So Resilient KC joined with Alive and Well St. Louis. So we started Alive and Well Kansas City and Alive and Well St. Louis, which together make Alive and Well Communities. I'll say that one more time. So there's Alive and Well St. Louis, Alive and Well Kansas City, both make up Alive and Well Communities. And so here on the Kansas City side, some may not be aware, but there is a Kansas City, Missouri and a Kansas City, Kansas. So we actually cover both Missouri and Kansas through Alive and Well Communities. So with that brief introduction of how we came about, I will actually go ahead and turn it over to Sean to get us kicked off with the presentation for today.
Thank you, Abe. Rachel, if we could go to the next slide, please. So sharing just a little bit more about our organization, sharing with you our mission. And as Alive and Well Communities, we operate where community is central to everything that we do. And so with the mission of activating communities to heal, We do this in partnership with community by elevating the community wisdom in all of the geographies that we have the privilege of serving, by disrupting systemic oppression, recognizing that as long as inequity persists, trauma still persists, acting with urgency and making sure that trauma doesn't wait another day, yet alone another generation, and making sure that rooted in the science, we're elevating those innovative solutions to activate our communities to heal. So Rachel, could you go to the next slide for me? So today's session is actually going to be part of a larger series. And our larger series is going to cover everything from addressing social determinants of health and understanding the intersection with trauma, to our third session, we'll be looking at really the clinical application of trauma-informed care, with the final session of how do we begin to implement trauma-informed care in healthcare organizations. So in order to set the stage for our later series, what we're going to be covering today is really just a foundation of what is trauma and why is it important to think in these contexts as we're understanding the needs of our patients as well as our communities and understanding the importance of becoming trauma-informed. Now, too often when we think about this word trauma, we think about very emergent situations, we think about really specific events. But what we have to start to understand is that when we're only thinking about specific events, we limit one's experience of trauma through our own personal frame of reference. So rather than using a definition to conceptualize trauma, we utilize SAMHSA's framework to really understand trauma and its impact. Rachel, can you move to the next slide for me, please? In SAMHSA's framework, we look at the 3 E's for understanding trauma. And inherent in the 3 E's is the notion that trauma is an individualized experience, recognizing that what may be traumatic for me may not be traumatic for you as an individual, and recognizing that what's traumatic for you may not be traumatic for someone else. So recognizing first and foremost that trauma is an individualized experience. So let's go through these 3 E's piece by piece to see how they connect to help us understand in a larger context what is trauma. The first E is the traumatic event. And as we're thinking about a traumatic event, we're thinking about any threat to safety, whether it be our physical or psychological safety, and recognizing that as we're thinking about a threat, we're thinking about any actual threat to safety or anything that an individual may perceive as a threat based on their lived experience. A great example of this is thinking about if you were to go outside right now, you were outside maybe hopefully enjoying some sun, you feel the breeze, and as you're outside, you just happen to hear a car backfire. Now, for some of us, we might not have any reaction to that car backfiring. But for others, they may jump, they may be startled, they may yell, they may even be motivated to run from that sound. Now, what we want to recognize is that car backfiring actually isn't a threat. But what we also have to recognize at the same time is that perceived threats to our safety are just as real to the brain and body as any actual threat to safety. So recognizing the power of those perceived threats. What we also want to recognize as the traumatic event is that a traumatic event is also the lack, withholding, or control of resources one needs for healthy development. And recognizing that we have needs for healthy development from conception all the way till we pass, that not just children have material and relational needs for healthy development. But when those resources for a healthy development are limited or restricted, that's also traumatic. So that moves us then into really understanding the lived experience. And the lived experience is going to be how we assign meaning to that traumatic event above. And that's going to be shaped by one's experience of previous trauma, recognizing that trauma doesn't hide in some deep, dark corner of our mind, but that any current threat to safety actually activates those previous threats to safety. That lived experience is also going to be based on personal factors such as that individual's ability for resilience, that individual's self-concept, self-worth, ability to self-regulate, and also what resources does the individual have to mitigate that traumatic event, both financial as well as relational resources. And then based on that lived experience, we can see two very different effects. Now, one thing we often see in traumatic events is that many people experience the same event, but we see very different responses and ultimately long-term effects. And we often wonder why we see such different effects when so many people have experienced the same exact event. And what we want to recognize is that it's really that trauma is that individualized experience, that it's not just the event we have to take into consideration, but really what is one's lived experience when it comes to that traumatic event. Rachel, can you move to the next slide for me? As we look a little bit more closely at traumatic events, we know that one means of categorizing traumatic events is into public versus private event trauma. And as we think about private event trauma, we think about those things that happen behind closed doors. Now, as we think about private event trauma, things like abuse, whether it's physical, sexual, whether it's verbal or psychological, whether it's even financial, spiritual, or technological abuse, types of abuse come often to mind as we think about private event trauma. Oftentimes, when we think about private event trauma, it's those things we don't actually want to name or give voice to. And as a result, we know there's often an air of secrecy surrounding private event trauma. Even for those who experience private event trauma, there's sometimes a fear of disclosure out of worry that they may not be believed. Or sometimes we have to recognize that manipulation, force, or coercion may be involved in that private event, really encouraging the individual to remain secret. And for some, recognizing that some individuals may not have the life experience, especially children, may not have the life experience to recognize that what's happening to them shouldn't be happening to them. So for many various reasons, we see this secrecy surrounding private event trauma. And as a result of that secrecy, we often see isolation and hopelessness arise. Rachel, can we go to the next slide, please? As we think about public event trauma, we think about those things that happen out in the open. Now, the event itself happens out in the open, while much of the aftermath happens in private, happens individually. But we're looking at where did the event itself occur. Now, in public event trauma, because there's a shared experience and it happens out in the open, we don't necessarily see that same judgment attached that we see in private event trauma. But what we want to recognize is in public event trauma, after a certain amount of time passes, we can see layers added to that trauma, because too often we think that someone should have gotten over that experience, that someone should just be able to move on, that others were able to move on. So we want to recognize that with time, we do often see judgment enter the picture when it comes to public event trauma. Now, in public event trauma, because of the forces beyond our control, because I have no control over my external environment, we can see a sense of helplessness arise. Rachel, can we look at the next slide, please? Now, even though we talk about public event trauma, too often what's missing from the discourse is this notion of community trauma. That too often we still just talk about interpersonal experiences when we think about public event trauma. But what we want to recognize is that community trauma is just as impactful. And what we want to recognize with community trauma is also the persistent nature of that trauma. So too often in trauma, we think about experiences that have happened in the past. And when it comes to community trauma, we want to recognize that the trauma may be ongoing, that it didn't just happen yesterday, and it didn't just happen today, but it has the potential to happen on an ongoing basis. And we're going to come back to this notion of community trauma in a little bit here. Rachel, can we look at the next slide, please? Now we know anytime there's a threat to our safety, whether it's our physical safety or psychological safety, whether it's an actual threat or even a perceived threat to our safety, we have this autonomic stress response that kicks into gear to keep the body safe, regardless of if it's a public event, private event, or community event trauma. Now, this stress response system is actually something that's developed already when we're born. And the stress response system is often referred to as our fight, flight, freeze response. Now, too often we just focus on that fight and flight response without that recognition fully of freeze and how it may show up. Now, what we want to recognize is that for individuals who experience this freeze response, that this freeze response is actually much more common in private event trauma. But too often, when it comes to that freeze response and it comes to private event trauma, this is often met with individuals by sayings like, why didn't you just run? Why didn't you just hide, kick, scream, yell, punch? Why didn't you come tell someone? And what we want to recognize is in using that kind of language that we add to layers of the trauma someone experiences. That when it comes to our fight, flight, freeze response, it's really easy in hindsight to say, oh, if that situation had happened to me, I would have fought, I would have ran. But what we want to recognize is that until we're faced with that same exact situation, we don't know how our stress response system will respond. That the stress response system is that autonomic response in an effort to keep the body safe in that moment. That it's not a rational decision of should I run, should I freeze, should I fight? But really it's this instantaneous autonomic response in an effort to keep the body safe that will activate anytime there's a threat to one's safety. Rachel, can we look at the next slide, please? Now, moving forward, we're going to really focus on this notion of chronic trauma. And there are two primary reasons why we focus on chronic trauma. Reason number one is that we know that experiencing just one traumatic event in childhood can make an individual vulnerable to experiencing trauma across the lifespan. The second reason we focus on chronic trauma is that we know that in today's world, 26% of children will experience their first traumatic event prior to the age of 4. So not their last, not their only, but their first. So too often when we hear about one's traumatic event, we have this natural response of really thinking about it as a singular, isolated event, of thinking about it in a context that this is the only traumatic event an individual has experienced. But what we want to recognize is that one traumatic event that I have awareness of may actually be part of a much larger trauma narrative. So when we think about chronic trauma, we're thinking about one or multiple of three scenarios. We're thinking about experiencing the same event repeatedly. We're also thinking about experiencing multiple different types of traumatic events. That recognizing that even from different types of trauma, there's a compounding effect. And then the third scenario that we pull out is that environmental or community trauma. And again, the reason we pull this out is because we want to recognize that there's a persistent nature, especially to community trauma, that it didn't just happen in the past, but an ongoing potential threat to one's safety. Now, for the longest time, when we thought about trauma, we thought of it just as a psychological concern. But regardless of what type of trauma it is, based on the science, we recognize that trauma impacts the developing brain architecture, has chronic consequences on our physical health, and impacts how we engage with the world around us. That in short, trauma is so powerful, it's a whole body, whole being experience. Rachel, can we look at the next slide, please? Now we know that more than 50% of the general population have experienced at least one traumatic event. And I want you to think for a brief moment, what do you think is the prevalence of trauma in the community that you have a privilege of serving? Think about, would you say it's lower than that average? Would you say it's on par with that national average? Or would you say in your community it's higher? With that thought process, Rachel, can we look at that next slide, please? I want to share a few more statistics. We know that children who went through the foster care system as adults have diagnosable rates of PTSD twice that than veterans who served during wartime. Now, let me be very clear. This is in no way to diminish the experience of our veterans who so selflessly serve our country. But we want to recognize that for a long period of time, the only individuals we thought who could have a diagnosis of PTSD were those who experienced war and those who were survivors of sexual assault, which means for a really long time, we were ignoring trauma all around us. We also know that nearly 40% of adolescents have directly witnessed an act of violence. And I'll share with you as a talking point, Ava and I have put in a dated statistic. This statistic that you see is actually from 1998. So think for a moment, in this day and age where we have access to smartphones, where we had instant access to news and social media, what might this statistic look like today? So what I want to do is I want to bring us back to the foundational study that really opened our eyes to the impact of trauma. Rachel, can we look at the next slide? Many of you may be aware with the ACE study, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And the ACE study was conducted back in 1995, and it was designed to really answer two central questions. It was designed to answer, what is the prevalence of childhood trauma? And two, what is the impact of that childhood trauma on adults? So for the purposes of this research study that was conducted by Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control, they enrolled over 17,000 individuals, asked them about their previous childhood trauma, and overlaid their complete medical history. Before we go into some of the findings, a few more things I want to highlight about the ACE study. Number one, let's look at the study demographic, the over 17,000 individuals enrolled in this study. As we look at the demographic, we see about 75% Caucasian, 39% had college degrees or higher in their field of study. Everyone was employed at the time of the study, and everyone in the study had private health insurance. So as you think about the population you may serve, you may think about that this population for the ACE study wasn't maybe representative of the population you serve. We also want to consider that who was really included in this study, as well as who may have been excluded in this study. The second point I want to highlight about the ACE study is that for the purposes of this research study, they only looked at 10 types of childhood adversity. They looked at child abuse, which was broken down into physical, sexual, and verbal abuse. They looked at child neglect, physical and psychological, and then trauma in the household environment, which specifically looked at substance use in the home, violence towards mom or stepmom, anyone in the home living with mental illness or expressing suicidal ideation, parental divorce or separation, or someone in the household who may have been incarcerated. So wanting to recognize that this list of 10 adversities is by no means complete. That as we think about the types of trauma or adversities that children have the potential to be exposed to today, that we have to recognize things like death, bullying, racism, homelessness, poverty, that many instances weren't even considered in the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. So with this understanding of the study demographic and the limited number of ACEs that were actually examined in this landmark study, let's take a look at some of the findings. So what we found in this study with this population of 17,000 individuals is that nearly 2/3 of individuals had experienced at least one type of trauma in childhood. And so that really opened our eyes to the understanding of just how prevalent trauma is. And for the longest time, we believed that one experiencing trauma in childhood was really an outlier. But what this study opened our eyes to is recognizing that trauma is far more common and pervasive than we ever thought. And this study also really opened our eyes, looking at a very affluent population, that trauma doesn't discriminate. That for too long, we've said things like trauma only exists in those communities to these types of individuals. But what the ACE study really opened our eyes to is that trauma doesn't discriminate, even though the silence surrounding trauma may be different in different areas. The other thing this study really opened our eyes to is some myths that we believed for a long time. Things like, oh, kids are so young when they experience trauma, they'll forget about it when they enter adulthood. Or kids are so super resilient, they'll just get over it. But what this landmark study really showed us is that without intervention, kids don't just forget, and they don't just get over it. That in fact, without intervention, trauma in childhood correlates with things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, certain types of cancer, as well as for those individuals who experience 6 or more types of trauma in childhood, we can see up to a 20-year reduction in life expectancy. And that really opened our eyes to the power of trauma. That trauma isn't just a psychological experience. That trauma is so powerful. It really has this experience on our whole body, our whole being, with even the potential to rewire the way our brain works and operates. So we're going to quickly look at a few specific findings from the ACE study, starting with clinical depression. Rachel, can we look at the next slide? Thank you. So here in this study, we're looking at clinical depression in adulthood. And below hand, you see the ACE score. Now, what's interesting about the ACE score is the ACE score doesn't refer to the number of traumatic events someone experienced. The ACE score refers to exclusively the types of trauma someone experienced. So because the ACE study looked at 10 types of trauma, the highest ACE score one could have is an ACE score of 10 if that individual experienced each one of those types of trauma. So one of the factors the ACE study doesn't take into consideration is the frequency of traumatic events. So regardless of whether someone experienced physical abuse once or 72 times, their point for domestic abuse would still just be a score of 1. So recognizing that the ACE score refers to types of trauma, not frequency of traumatic events. But what we see is regardless is that there's a dose response or a graded relationship with the number of, or the types of trauma one experienced in childhood and the prevalence of clinical depression in adulthood. Can we look at the next slide, please? Again, we see that graded dose response relationship, that the more types of trauma one experiences in childhood, the higher the prevalence of alcoholism in adulthood. And what we see in the ACE study is that one's experience of childhood trauma correlates with 40 different indicators of adverse outcomes. So recognizing that in the ACE study, we looked at everything from behavioral health indicators to physical health indicators. We even looked at social functioning indicators as they correlate to types of childhood trauma one experiences. And as you see, and what I think is a most curiosity for many of us on this call, is as we look at the next slide, is that there's a graded relationship, a dose-response relationship with many different adverse health outcomes, whether it be asthma, whether it be diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or even indicators such as ischemic heart disease. Rachel, can we go ahead and click? And we'll click one more time. And here, as we focus on the first third, we're looking at social functioning and that dose-response correlation between childhood trauma and one's social functioning in adulthood. And in this first third, we're looking specifically at absenteeism, which was defined as missing 2 or more days from work per month. And again, what we see is that graded dose-response correlation. The more types of childhood trauma one experiences, the higher the likelihood of missing work as an adult. And what we can see is this corresponds to many different factors. Things like that cold that's going around work. For someone who's experienced more types of trauma in childhood, their immune system may be adversely impacted. So that cold that's going around the office, that individual is more susceptible to catching. And when they do, it's going to keep them from work longer. What we can also see is that individuals may be missing work due to legitimate illness, things like the diabetes, the cardiovascular disease, the ischemic heart disease, the COPD. And what we can also see and recognize is that when someone's trauma is triggered, those symptoms of trauma aren't persistent, they're episodic. So when someone's trauma is triggered, things like the depression, the anxiety, the overwhelming feeling of being unsafe surfaces, even those unsustainable coping mechanisms that we may engage in to try to self-medicate or to keep ourselves safe. So what we can see and what we have to understand is that from that trauma experienced so long ago, that it still has an impact today. That trauma doesn't just go away with time. That what we have to recognize is that without intervention, that trauma correlates with so many different poor health outcomes and as well as social adversity. Can we go ahead and look at the next slide, please? Now, what you'll see in the ACE study is that they really only focused on that private and public event trauma, but only those interpersonal experiences of trauma. Thanks to one of our national partners, BCR, Building Community Resilience, based in Washington, D.C., what we have to understand is the power of that community trauma, what BCR defines as adverse community environments. What we have to recognize is that community trauma really serves as toxins in our soil. Those toxins that really prevent us from thriving, from growing alive and well as individuals, and those toxins that then make us vulnerable to interpersonal experiences of trauma. So what we have to start to do is think beyond just adverse childhood experiences and really start to think in terms of the parabases, recognizing the power of adverse community environments. Now, from a national landscape, what BCR has identified is toxins like poverty, discrimination, community disruption, lack of opportunity, economic mobility and social capital, poor housing quality and affordability, as well as community violence. But really thinking about what might be the toxins in your soil, what might be the toxins in your community that may be preventing your community or your patients from thriving in that soil. So if we were to look specifically at St. Louis, we wouldn't think about just discrimination in general. We would have to name more specifically racism as a toxin in our soil, recognizing that there are many historical implications of racism, as well as we see how those historical implications are still present today, and how that racism, as a result, then makes someone then more vulnerable to experiences like homelessness, substance use, depression. So recognizing we have to be able to name those toxins in our soil if we're going to begin to address trauma. And that we have to understand that trauma, regardless of what type of trauma it is, has an impact on individuals as well as our community. So thinking beyond just the adverse childhood experiences study and recognizing the power of community trauma and thinking more broadly in terms of those pair of ACEs. Can we look at the next slide, please? Now, earlier I mentioned the impact on the brain. And what we want to recognize is trauma's power to actually rewire the brain architecture for safety and survival. That trauma, those experiences of trauma rather, really inhibit our prefrontal cortex from fully being able to develop those synaptic connections, to develop that synaptic density, that as a result of those experiences of trauma, the brain wires for safety and survival. As a result of that activation of that fight, flight, freeze response in the immediate aftermath, as well as when coping with trauma. And as a result, that trauma then inhibits things like memory, that it causes difficulties paying attention to tasks. In early childhood, that trauma may even look like a learning disability in a child because of a result of those traumatic experiences. The prefrontal cortex hasn't been stimulated as it should. As a result, what we see is that those survival synaptics are really then overstrengthened. And we know that things like language then becomes inhibited because language is really in our prefrontal cortex. But as a result of that lack of stimulation in the prefrontal cortex, we see those delayed development of verbal abilities, as well as our ability then to regulate our emotions and behaviors, that executive functioning that really takes place in the prefrontal cortex. But again, trauma is so powerful that it rewires the brain for safety and survival in an effort to mitigate future traumatic experiences, in an effort to survive in the present moment. Can we look at the next slide, please? What we often think is that traumatic memories and other types of memories imprint in the same way. And what we want to recognize is traumatic memories imprint in a very different way in our brains. That is, you think about something like what you had for dinner 3 weeks ago, you may not be able to recall that. But if you think about the last time you were just almost in a car accident, you may notice that as you start to really think about it, you may start to recognize things like heart rate elevating. You may start to notice some tension in your body, anxiety even. You may even be able to feel that seatbelt strapped around you. And that's from just an almost car accident. What we want to recognize is that traumatic experiences imprint in a sensory manner in the brain, meaning that any one of our 5 senses can then trigger those traumatic events, activating that fight, flight, freeze response once again. And that's what really counts those perceived threats to safety. That recognizing when we experience one of those 5 triggers, that we may then have that reactivation of our fight, flight, freeze response. Now, as we think about that fight, flight, freeze response, and we look at the next slide, we want to recognize that while this fight, flight, freeze response is designed to keep our body safe, we also want to recognize that this fight, flight, freeze response was only designed to activate sporadically. That whenever we experienced a threat to our safety, whether a psychological threat or a physical threat, whether a perceived threat or an actual threat to our safety, that this stress response activated and it would release a whole host of hormones to keep the body safe. Now, in the short term, those hormones help us to fight, flee, and freeze. But what we want to recognize is from frequent activation of the stress response system, as well as prolonged activation of the stress response system, that these mechanisms that are designed to keep my body safe start to become toxic to my own body. For example, that in order to help me fight, flee, or freeze, to help feed that adrenaline, there's a spike in my blood sugar. Well, from frequent and prolonged activation and that spike in my blood sugar, what we can see is the onset of diabetes. That cortisol release that happens anytime the stress response system is activated, it serves as an anti-inflammatory in the short term. But what we know is in the long term, that constant release of cortisol can actually start to deplete calcium from my bones, making an individual vulnerable to bone breakage and bone fracture. And the resting heart rate for someone who's experienced chronic trauma can be up to 20 beats faster per minute, meaning that even in a calm, relaxed state, that for that individual who's experienced chronic trauma, their heart is working faster and harder than it should be, which is how we see the development of cardiovascular disease, including ischemic heart disease. That stress response system that's designed to keep my body safe from frequent and prolonged activation from a result of that chronic trauma actually starts to become toxic to my own body, which is how we see all those long-term chronic physical health conditions for individuals. Can we go ahead and look at the next slide, please? What we're looking at here is what we refer to as our window of stress tolerance. And this is really that melding of the brain and body's response together. And so as you look at the smooth, curvy line, this is how, in an ideal world, we'd like everyone to work and operate under stress. That when I become stressed out, my stress level rises, but I'm able to self-soothe and self-activate, self-soothe and self-regulate. That this morning when I was driving to work and a car cut me off, rather than doing something like slamming on the gas and trying to speed up and cut that car off, I had to say to myself, Sean, you're safe, breathe, everyone's all right. If you do something that you shouldn't do, you may cause others harm. And so I was able in that moment to self-soothe and self-regulate and remain in my window of stress tolerance, which we see represented as that space in between these two dotted white lines. Now, for individuals who experience chronic trauma, anytime there's an activating event, we want to recognize that because the brain rewires for safety and survival, that we don't see those same responses within the window of stress tolerance. That what we can see is that an individual may shoot above the window of stress tolerance into the space of hyperarousal. And this is really that activation of the fight and flight response, where we see things like anxiety, anger, rage, mania. Or what we can see is hypoarousal, where we see things like apathy, isolation, disconnection, depression. Now that hyperarousal is really that activation of my fight and flight response. And hypoarousal is really that activation of my freeze response. Now, what we want to recognize is that this red line is actually a normal process as a result of those abnormal traumatic events that someone has experienced. That as a result of that chronic trauma, that this red line starts to activate at lower and lower thresholds in an effort to keep the body safe, in an effort to not experience another traumatic event. Let me give you just a really brief example. As a therapist, one of my favorite pastimes is going to any sort of crowded venue, getting there early, finding a seat, and people watching. And this summer, getting an opportunity to go to many Cardinals games. And for those of you from Chicago, I'm sorry, but Cardinals did wonderful last night. One of the things I see anytime I'm people watching at any one of those crowded sporting events is something that I see oftentimes in one setting where people are briskly walking past each other in this crowded space. One person accidentally nudges the other person in passing, and the other person turns around and they're ready to fight. And it's so easy to say, wow, that's such a disproportionate response to accidentally getting your shoulder brushed. What's wrong with that person? But what the science of trauma actually teaches us is something very different. For that individual who's experienced chronic trauma, that mere brush of the shoulder activated that fight, flight, freeze response, saying to the individual, you're in danger. And in that moment, the brain automatically moved to hyperarousal in an attempt to keep the body safe from yet another traumatic event. Now, we see hyper and hypoarousal day in and day out in our healthcare settings without recognition that it's actually maybe linked to trauma. We see things like someone being impatient in the waiting room, or anxious in the waiting room, or explosive in the waiting room. We see someone who may leave against medical advice. We see individuals who, as we're sharing a diagnosis with them, they have that deer in the headlights look, that they may be physically present but mentally not there. And starting to think about how are the numerous ways we see hyper and hypoarousal show up in our healthcare settings, too often not recognizing the experience of trauma, and oftentimes criminalizing those expressions of safety and survival. Can we look at the next slide, please? So as we think about this process of becoming trauma-informed, it's about truly integrating the 4 R's throughout our organization. That it's about realizing the widespread impact of trauma, recognizing those signs and symptoms of trauma, responding by integrating the knowledge and science of trauma, and resisting re-traumatization. Now, what you'll see in here is it doesn't say that each of our organizations need to become therapists to address the trauma, but it's really about how do we integrate the science of trauma throughout our organization to really support the individuals we have the privilege of serving. Thinking about how is it that many times, even unintentionally, we re-traumatize individuals in our organizations, in our spaces, whether it be from the built environment or whether it be from asking an individual after a traumatic event to multiple times recount their traumatic experience. So what we have to recognize is infuse this knowledge throughout our system. But what we also want to recognize is that this process of becoming trauma-informed is not just about those we have the privilege of serving. That this process of becoming trauma-informed is a 360 process. It's about those who do the service within our organizations to those we serve. Recognizing that we have to integrate this knowledge into everything we do, from our HR practices, our fiscal practices, to how we engage in the front lines with our patients and clients. Can we look at the next slide, please? So here what you see is the core principles of trauma-informed care, that we infuse the principles of safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, empowerment into everything we do, into every single aspect of our organization. And what we have to recognize is that these pieces fit together like a puzzle to help us work towards achieving equity, but also recognizing that equity is the glue that holds these pieces together. That without equity, we can't truly build trauma-informed environments. That as long as inequity persists in our environments, that we are not actually trauma-informed. That with that inequity, we can't truly build safety or collaboration, choice, trustworthiness, or empowerment in our environments. So we have to be equity-centered in our approach to building trauma-informed environments. And again, this process of becoming trauma-informed is 360, recognizing that how can I support the safety of those I have the privilege of serving if I myself don't feel safe within my organization? And we'll spend much more time in future webinars talking about these. We click to the next slide. So while we know there are clinical and therapeutic interventions, what we also want to recognize in the science of trauma is that you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. That the science indicates that it just takes one buffering, unwavering individual to mitigate the trajectory of trauma. While it's always best to intervene earlier, we also know it's never too late to be intervened. So recognizing how as systems in the helping professions can we create really a process of being a support rather than re-traumatizing individuals, recognizing that it isn't just about clinical intervention, that it's also about the relationships we build within our organization. But in order to play that role of that one buffering, unwavering support, we have to recognize a few things. Can we click on the next slide? We have to recognize that even unintentionally in our organizations, we may trigger someone's trauma. So we have to start to understand those changes in behaviors and responses as really one's means for safety and survival, for one's means for coping, recognizing that trauma rewires our brain for safety and survival, which means we have to infuse this lens of trauma into everything we do. And we do this by starting to change the question. Can we look at the next slide, please? So rather than asking, what's wrong with you, when we see things like yelling in our waiting rooms or people leaving against medical advice, or maybe not adhering to therapies as prescribed, rather than asking what's wrong, we need to change that question and ask, what happened to you? And not just what happened to you, but also asking what's continuing to happen to this individual. And when we start to change the question, we can start to intervene in ways that supports those we have the privilege of serving. And changing the question, while we've made it sound incredibly easy that you just have to change from what's wrong with you to what happened, we have to recognize that asking what happened to you isn't inherent in our nature. Like this morning when I was cut off by that car, even as a therapist, I didn't ask, what happened to you? I asked, what's wrong with you? And so we have to recognize that changing the question has to happen with intent, has to happen not just at the interpersonal level, but also as the systems level as we work to become trauma-informed. So what we've done today is really started to build a foundation for understanding trauma, so we can work in future webinars to really understand the connection between trauma and social determinants of health, really starting to think about clinical application and trauma-informed care, and also how do we begin this journey of change in healthcare organizations. And so with that, I want to turn it back to Rachel, so we can answer any questions that may have as we've worked to lay a brief foundation of understanding trauma.
Thank you so much, Sean, for that wonderful presentation. So we're going to take a couple of questions for the next few minutes. So please, if you have any questions, submit them into our chat box and we will go ahead and get started answering them. The first question we have from one of our participants or presenters is asking about the ACE studies. And they mentioned that there's a lot of emphasis placed on trauma experienced by maternal figures and how that is transferred to children. And the participant wants to know if there were ever studies repeated and expanded to include domestic abuse directed at paternal figures.
That's a great question, and absolutely in the initial ACE study, and remembering that the ACE study was initially conducted back in 1995, we thought about domestic violence in a very one-dimensional manner, only violence towards women, when we know that that's much broader than we ever appreciated back in 1995. In other renditions of the ACE study, it looked at domestic violence more broadly. So not just towards mom or stepmom, but much more broadly. Now, what we want to recognize is that many states and many communities have replicated pieces of the ACE study, but the ACE study in its full entirety has never been replicated. What we've looked at is we've looked at things like doing an ACEs survey with our community or specific population and asking individuals about their experiences of childhood trauma in various communities and states. But only in limited studies have we overlaid that information with health correlations or health outcomes. And so the full ACE study hasn't been replicated in its entirety on a large scale like we saw back in 1995. But other renditions of it or versions have looked at that domestic violence much more broadly.
Great, thank you. Another one of our participants asked, aside from Alive and Well Communities, of course, what are other examples of organizations that have integrated trauma-informed care work into either as therapists or if they're not related, any organizations you've worked with?
So in organizations we work with, we see across sectors many organizations working to become trauma-informed. What we see, especially in Missouri, is that schools have been early adopters of integrating the science of trauma, toxic stress, and resilience and working towards becoming trauma-informed. What we know is that the trauma-informed movement was actually born within the mental health sector. And so we see many behavioral health organizations working to become trauma-informed. But now what we see is across sectors, anywhere from the criminal justice sector to healthcare organizations working to become trauma-informed. So across our state, we see many federally qualified health centers working to become trauma-informed. We even see such big hospital systems as sectors of Barnes-Jewish Hospital here in St. Louis, as well as Children's Mercy Hospital based in Kansas City, working to become trauma-informed. So while it was really born within the behavioral health sector, and we see schools as early adopters in this journey, we see it really spreading across sectors. That becoming trauma-informed is necessary for supporting individuals and those who do the service, that we can't expect health outcomes to change unless we look at the root cause of them and understanding trauma as that root cause.
Wonderful. So we're just about at 2 o'clock, and I don't want to take up anybody's time too much. But thank you for all these wonderful questions. As we've mentioned, we hope to get to these, all of these questions in future webinar topics with Alive and Well Communities. So thank you to everybody for joining us today. Thank you so much to our presenters from Alive and Well Communities. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the Root Cause Coalition website later this week. We also have another webinar coming up on August 13th How to Advance Racial Equity and Create Business Value, presented by FSG Consulting, will be on August 13th at 1:30 p.m. We hope many of you will be able to join us for that as well. Thank you so much. We hope everyone has a great weekend. And again, thank you to our presenters for this wonderful and informative presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to email anybody at the Root Cause Coalition. We are more than happy to help. Thank you so much.